Hello and welcome to Sustainable Switch live at Reuters Impact Day 2. I'm Sharon Kimathi, Energy and ESG Editor at Reuters and creator and curator of the Sustainable Switch newsletter. Here I'll be taking you through some of my favorite parts of the newsletter live. Talking points will begin with Editor-in-Chief of Ethical Corporation magazine, Terry Slavin, followed by In Conversation with Dr. Angela Wilkinson, who is the CEO of the World Energy Council, and finally ESG Spotlight with Chris Williams from ISB Global. Well, thank you so much for joining me here today, Terry.
I'm delighted. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yes, so Ethical Corporation magazine, by the way, is a sustainable business magazine published by Reuters. And speaking of which, in the latest edition of Ethical Corporation magazine, what are some of the standout articles or features that address pressing sustainability issues or innovative solutions within the corporate world?
Okay, well, Ethical Corporation's actually been around for 21 years. So we're kind of part of the events business that transferred over to Reuters. And what we do is we take a deep dive into sustainability issues every 2 months. And this month it's a sustainable fashion industry. It's about sustainability in the fashion industry. And it's not appreciated how big a contributor the fashion industry is. 2 to 8% of global CO2 emissions come from the fashion industry, which is huge. And that variation, because it depends on the energy mix and if it's coal or renewables, and also what consumers are doing with your product. And the Scope 3 emissions, as they're called, is like in the whole supply chain and also in consumer use. That's 96% of the impact of the fashion industry. And yet, despite there's been a huge amount of talk in the industry about sustainability and green fashion, they've really barely scratched the surface of that 96% of their Scope 3 emissions. So one of the biggest issues is the production, which is, it's doubled in the past 15 years. So what we're seeing is a huge glut of fast fashion and yet very little recycling on the other end. In fact, only 1% of textiles are recycled into new textiles. So there's companies really are promoting the recycled content in their product, but in fact what they're doing in almost all cases is they are using PET bottles, which should actually be used in the drinks sector where it can be recycled many, many times. And it's actually but the fact that the fashion industry is actually taking a lot of that has driven up prices for the drinks. And I was talking to Innocent Drinks, the CEO of Innocent Drinks at the last conference, and he said, we wanted to go 100% recycled, and we couldn't because the high cost of that, and lack of availability, and both of them are contributing to the same thing. So I guess one of the and the whole idea of the circular economy, about the rent and resale and repair and things like Vinted, which I only buy my clothes off Vinted now. I don't know about you, but they're still only accounting for 3.5% of the whole market. And you have a company like Patagonia, which is has really been one of the pioneers on this, and they're still it's still a very tiny fraction of their entire. So they're pumping out more and more and more. So we have articles. We have one article in the magazine that looks at, why it's been so difficult to get that textile to textile recycling, and what companies like Adidas and Inditex, which owns Zara, have been doing to try and some of these barriers. A lot of these barriers, it's not so much the technology, it's the cost. And the cost, as I've discovered through the years of doing this, is just, that's the factor. And you're talking fast fashion and cheap fashion. and it's overcoming those, the high costs. But I think there are solutions, and I think as in a lot, it all comes down to a lot of the cost, and a lot of it comes down to the regulations. So you need to have the regulatory environment that pushes it on everybody. And you're starting to see that in Europe with the impact of new regulations that's trying to crack down on the fast fashion industry. So we've got another piece on the impact in Asia, how our supply chain is trying to gear up for this new legislation, because they are going to be face being locked out if they can't conform to it. So, and then you've got 350 million workers in the cotton supply chain that are affected by climate change and the huge issues over that. And then there's forced labor laws that have come in the US. So actually, companies are now having to take direct liability for human rights abuses in their supply chains because of this. And how's that affecting the sector? So it's been a really interesting issue. That was a really interesting issue to work on.
Yes. I mean, fashion is like everywhere. And I know I'm a huge fan of fashion. I know you were speaking about, vintage. Yeah. I'm a huge vintage fan too. This is vintage. Very 80s, I feel, retro. Yeah. But what are the other key themes and trends that readers can expect to see covered in Ethical Corporation magazine this year? And how does it align with the current global sustainability challenges?
Well, we've just, the issue before that was about plastic waste. And the next issue we've got coming up, which I'm working on at the moment, is about the carbon removals industry. A lot of it, I think, is tied to impacts on nature, because I see this as the big theme, the big synergy between the climate and nature stories, which for companies, the companies are very cognizant and schooled in CO2 emissions. And there is one metric for it. It's CO2 emissions or CO2 equivalent. They can measure it. They can manage it. What you can't measure, you can't manage. And this whole area of nature, and we are really seeing, and you've seen this summer even, the impact of what climate change is having on nature. The risks are increasing, so the risks to companies are increasing of their supply chain from nature, and what not only the risks to them, but also the risks they are posing to nature. At this moment, we have David Craig of the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, who's presenting. This is going to be the nature version of the TCFDs, which was really instrumental in the climate. That's going to provide a lot of more clarity and bring nature into the conversation and onto the radar of companies. So in December in Montreal, there was the COP15 and this global framework for biodiversity. So it's not only climate, but nature has to be taken into account. And I think that's the theme. That's the area I think that companies need the most kind of guidance on. There's been a flood of different guidance that's coming. Yesterday, Marco Lambertini from Special Envoy for WWF announced that they have come up with a nature positive agenda, a nature positive initiative to bring clarity. TNFD is bringing clarity to this, and some guidance and practical guidelines for how companies can actually bring that nature into their reporting. And the key thing, too, is unlike the TCFDs, which was very much about companies reporting on their climate risk, and which has given, I think, rise to a lot of the concern about ESG, has been the idea that companies can be very good about reporting on their climate risk without actually having to do anything about it. So you can say it's on your radar and you're managing those risks. But with the TCFDs, companies are going to have to actually report on what their impacts are, as well as the impacts of nature on them. And I think that's going to bring a lot more transparency and hopefully some action. But so the carbon removal space, which we are writing about now, I mean, we're talking about a gigaton of CO2 that's going to have to be removed in order to keep within the 1.5 C. There's a big tension, I think, between whether we are going to be like some of these very expensive engineered solutions like direct air capture. Tension between those kind of solutions, very geoengineering, and the tree-based and nature-based solutions. And there are some that are in between. But, you know, can we resolve those? Can this actually bring some integrity to the whole offsets market, which has also had a lot of controversy this year? So that's what we're looking at.
And plastic is something that you've spoken about as well. So it remains a major environmental concern. Could you share some insights from the magazine's recent coverage on strategies and initiatives by businesses to reduce plastic waste and promote more sustainable packaging practices?
Okay, well, again, that plastics, I mean, there have been a lot of corporate initiatives on plastics. Don't know if they've really moved the needle. The problem is, almost with fashion, is volume. Right. And so at the same time that the fossil fuel industry is having to retrench, and there's been a lot of pressure on them to transition, there hasn't been the same amount of pressure on them to transition from what else they do, and that has been the increase in production of plastics. So that falls under a bit of the radar, but there's just been so much more plastic put out there in the environment. So billions of dollars in new plastics factory. So, and the problem again, as with fashion, recycled materials only making up a very small fraction of what's out, and a lot of it is getting into the environment. And something I learned through this as well, I commissioned a piece on microplastics, and I was expecting it to be from the fashion industry because you hear a lot about that. But actually it's from the tire industry. And again, so that's, but, it is actually much more from the tire industry. And it's, with EV, it's only going to make it worse because they're much heavier. So that's the other big elephant in the room that hasn't actually had much press, and and you've got something like company like a piece I did on Tetra Pak. So only about it makes 193 billion cartons a year. Only about a quarter of them are recycled, and even that's globally, and even in Europe where we've got very sophisticated recycling, it's only 50%, and it down to the problem of we're very good at now sophisticated composite materials. Tetra Pak has got this aluminium foil, that tiny little foil, that it has really been the problem with recycling. So what we were reporting on the fact that actually Tetra Pak is trialing now to remove that foil. And by doing that, that could unlock huge amounts more of its capacity to be recycled. And that's a very, very, I went in Iceland, I went to a recycling facility, and they said that is their biggest problem is Tetra Pak packaging because you don't know what to do with it, and there's so much of it. So as again with the fashion, with the composite fabrics are the problem with recycled, so it is with this. So Yeah, there's a lot in that.
Plenty to unpack, right?
Plenty
when it comes
to unpack.
To plastics. But you also mentioned about carbon removal too.
Yeah.
Now, their strategies are gaining some prominence in the fight against climate change. What has Ethical Corporation uncovered in terms of innovative approaches and corporate involvement in carbon removal? And how do these contribute to achieving global carbon reduction goals?
Well, that's exactly how, that is the whole question of how it's going to go. There's been a lot of concern about the offsets market, the natural offsets market. So there's actually been a dip in investment in that as a result. But as I was told by the CEO of Climeworks today at the conference, that has really led to the increase in investment in them. But they're seeing 7-figure investments from Microsoft, Stripe, companies like Boston Consulting Group going into DAC. You're getting billions of dollars that have just been through the Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S. So they're really backing DAC. But it's that tension between the nature, again, and technical solutions, and whether we need to have, and how you have both. I think it's an either or, and what's the optimum level that they can both work in harmony rather than one crowding out the other.
Well, thank you so much for that innovative insight that you've given me on Tetra Pak, on carbon removals, and plenty to unpack on plastics.
Great.
But thank
Great
you
to
so
talk
much.
to you. Thanks, Sharon.
Welcome back to In Conversation with Dr. Angela Wilkinson, CEO and Secretary General of the World Energy Council. I'm so pleased that you're here.
It's great to be here, Sharon.
Well, let's dive into it. So how should we think about the sustainable switch?
Well, in energy terms, sustainable switch is what we call the energy transition, the global energy transition, which might imply that there's something like a world energy system. And the reality is there's not a single energy system. There's multiple energy systems. They're very diverse. They're full of people and technologies, users and uses. And we talk a lot in terms of energy, in terms of supply. And we give the impression that it's a simple problem of just swapping out old technology and jobs for new technology and jobs. And it's a lot more challenging than that. Of course, we've got to get it done, but we can't get it done if we ignore and overlook the people and community side of that challenge. And how do we have to involve more people in understanding their roles and choices so that we can really make that switch at speed and scale?
And will we be forced to adapt to a 1.5 degree world?
I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the Paris Agreement, that if we achieve the Paris Agreement goal of net zero emissions by 2050, by mid-century, that we will be out of the climate boiling territory. If we achieve Paris, which will take a lot of work in itself, we will still have to adapt to the impacts of climate change, right? The weather effects that we're living at the moment are going to become more usual and frequent. And so we're going to have to think about how, when we manage the energy transition, how do we do it in a way where we are adapting to extreme weather events, and how are we doing it in a way where we are anticipating the energy needs of 10 billion people, as well as a healthy planet.
And what's the biggest barrier to making this energy transition happen?
So I think we live in a very divisive and polarizing times, and there's a lot of conversation about good versus bad, about heroes and villains. And I think this blame gaming and name shaming is a really terrible place to put us all in, with all this othering that's going on. And I think it's driven by fear. I think it's driven by fear of the future. I think it's driven by the fear of missing out. And it's driven by the fear of other. And I think that what we really need to do is we have to really break the mindset of a supply-centric conversation and really start to have a conversation about what does the future look like with 10 billion people living on a healthy planet, and then what's the shape of the energy systems we need, and then what does that mean for supply side choices, rather than supply lead the way.
Well, That's so interesting that you talked about the fear because, so yesterday I had Ranjita Rajan, and she is at the Oxford Smith School Institute, and she does talk about this fear, the sense of everyone has this fear of losing out money on the fossil fuel industry, fear of not understanding what the future looks like. So that is so interesting that that's now a recurring theme, it seems. Hopefully we can overcome these fears. And are you optimistic or pessimistic then about COP28?
Well, I've never been an optimist or a pessimist because both of them can excuse do nothing or business as usual. I'm a realistic hoper, and realistic hope is in agency, in doing something. So, COP28 is just over 70 something days away. But after that, we convene the World Energy Congress, our 100th anniversary Congress. And our job as the World Energy Council is to connect the diverse energy leaders across the whole system and the diverse energy transition interests, and really make sure that the conversation we have at Congress accelerates faster, fairer and more far-reaching energy transitions across all regions and involves more people and communities so that we are bringing everyone with us and no one gets left behind.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been really insightful and so thought-provoking. So where can people find you?
Well, the World Energy Council's online. We all live in virtual reality. But, we're a decentralized community network. So we operate across nearly 100 countries worldwide. Each of those have their own little World Energy Council community and organization. You'll find us in Congress in Rotterdam next year. We're everywhere.
Well,
just Google.
Yes, I will Google right away. Well, thank you so much, Angela. Well, thank you so much for joining me, Chris. It's such a pleasure to have you on this ESG Spotlight. I guess I'll start with, why does your company actually focus on so many of the issues of waste? Why does it matter? And what are the long-term consequences if we don't take action?
Well, I guess my story, personally, with waste management, it goes back to when I used to go to the dump with my dad. And I'm talking when I was 10 or 11 or 12, and it was quite a big event. Dad was a bit of a DIY guy, he was a bit of a builder. And in those days, of course, the dump, well, we now call a dump a landfill. So, we loaded up the car, we went down to the dump, and what we did is we threw everything into the dump, a hole in the ground. There were chemicals, there was furniture, there was appliances, there was our garden waste, there was food waste. Everything went into the dump, or the landfill as we call it now. And I think what occurred to me at the time, and I remember this really vividly, that we're burying lots of interesting stuff, lots of interesting material. I think I was thinking about there was toys and stuff getting buried, trucks and everything else. As a kid, I thought it was quite interesting. But, when Dad sort of flipped the paint tin out the back of the car, the lid came off, and the paint was there seeping into the earth, right? So bad news. But what we now know, of course, is that those dumps, those landfills, create something like 10% of the world's methane emissions, which is pretty bad news. Not to mention the greenhouse gases that go into the production, of the goods that we've just thrown to the ground. So I guess for me, from an early days and what we know now, waste matters. And given the current climate crisis that we're facing, I think the issue of waste management and poor waste management practices are as important as ever. And the second part of your question, you talked about what are the consequences. And if I come a bit closer to home, in the UK, there's 20,000 landfills, can you believe it, of which 500 are still being used. Of those 20,000, there's around 1,200 in coastal areas. And so not only have we buried vast amounts of great materials, valuable materials, poisoned the ground, creating a huge amount of methane emissions, but actually these coastal landfills are starting to open up, and the stuff is leaking out into the ocean again. So not far from here, and you'll see I've got some bags here, the Tilbury landfill just down in the Thames estuary is one of the 1,200 coastal landfills in the UK, and that was an active landfill or a dump from 1930 to it's about 50 years, 1980. and which is a long time. I mean, that's a lot of waste that was dumped in that. So I thought, look, I'm going to go down and see, what's happening in these landfills. So walking along the beach, in fact, there's a beach called Glass Beach because all the glass, you're just crunching in this glass. I mean, you've got to have your health and safety hat on down there, of course. There's plastic. I mean, you're walking over asbestos and other things. It's not really good stuff. And I did a bit of beach combing. And interestingly enough, there was a few bits I found which was interesting. This here was an old washing up liquid bottle, pretty well preserved, as you could see. We've been trying to do a bit of a Google on what this could be, and we can't find anything. So the assumption is it's probably quite old, well preserved plastic. This stuff is about to wash out into the Thames estuary. A couple of things. There's some perfectly formed nylon stocking. There was some fabrics there, and a nice pair of dentures. So you never know what you might find in a landfill. But the interesting thing with the cloth is that we all think stuff biodegrades in a landfill. Of course, it doesn't. Once you cap a landfill, it's there. In fact, you're sealing it. I couldn't believe I found both pairs. But actually, there's an old set of shoes here, which is incredible, right? An old set of leather shoes, and you can kind of imagine this stuff is not going to break. Leather's preserved. So it was a really interesting trip down there, and of course, thinking about my child, or thinking about what we're doing now, I always sort of think, what were we doing? What are we still doing, and what were we doing? Throwing all this stuff into a landfill. So pretty bad news.
That does not sound great, and I do wonder if they're my size.
That's right. Yeah. We won't need the teeth.
No. But waste management involves collaboration amongst various stakeholders, including consumers, business, and local governments. What approach and action is needed from these stakeholders to solve the issue of waste?
Yeah, again, there's a lot of parties that need to get together to look at this issue of poor waste management practices. And if I step back a little bit, we know we're all living what we call the linear economy. Yeah? So, that's what we're doing and discussing here today. Very much, we mine the material, we manufacture the material, we use the product, and we throw it away. That linear model absolutely has to change for all the reasons we've talked about. The good news is there's the circular economic model, the circular model, which really means that we should reduce what we're using, we should reuse, we should refurbish, we should repair, and only when something absolutely has to be thrown away, we should see if we can recycle it. So what we're trying to do with the circular model is track that molecule, track that material around that supply chain. And governments are really, really important to drive that circular model. And what we see, and it's quite topical at the moment, the Paris Agreement, which was signed up to by some 200 odd governments across the world, trying to limit global warming to no more than 1.5 degrees. Addressed every year, as we know, on the Conference of Parties, the next one coming up in Dubai. But the thing that really frustrates me with the Conference of Parties, you look at the agenda, even the agenda coming up, is waste is seldom mentioned. It's creating 10% of the world's methane emissions, yet we can't sit down and talk about poor waste management practices. So I get a bit frustrated with that, in my business. And I guess, carbon capture, solar, I know that stuff is all more interesting to talk about potentially, and I don't disagree, but I think it's time we need some change in that. But if I think just a bit closer to home from a government perspective, think about the UK. The UK's done pretty well. We've got the Environmental Act, which went into law last year, 2022, designed amongst other things to tackle waste and increase recycling. Right? So, some good stories. But there's also some easy wins in that. We need better education. We need better labelling. There's something I wrote about recently. We call it wish cycling. You've got a bit of recycling. You're looking at your bins and think, does it go on that one? Does it go on that one? Right, that's wish cycling. So sometimes you can actually contaminate your recycling by putting something in there. The pizza box, which you can't recycle because it's full of oil from the pizza. That goes in the general waste bin. That sort of thing. That's wish cycling. But what that act is also doing, encouraging councils, all the local authorities to give us better bins to segregate our waste. But it's also trying to drive local authorities and private enterprise to invest in more recycling facilities. I read something recently where it said the only way to really improve the UK's waste position is to stop exporting. We ban all exports of waste, and we do a lot of it. Then we have to invest, in manufacturing plants here. And I think Joe Biden passed a good bill last year, the Inflation Reducing Act, some billions set aside in terms of sustainability topics, which is great. Waste management's a big part of that. We've got a customer in North America who's just invested $100 million in a new recycling plant, so that's great news. But look, it remains to be seen, of course, how quickly, as always. They do say that the Environmental Act in the UK has been slow to get going, but what we need is, as everyone knows, we need to see action, and we need to see it quickly, right? That's absolutely important.
And could you provide examples of innovative technologies that can be implemented to enhance waste reduction, promote reuse, and improve recycling rates? And how do these innovations help businesses that employ them contribute to environmental goals and achieve a circular economy?
Yeah, we all look to rapid advancements in technology, to help solve this climate crisis. And we're all feeling the impacts. I mean, it's what a day we've got out here now. We've had heat waves, we've had flooding, we've had snow where we wouldn't expect it. Sometimes you think those 100-year events are happening every other week, right? So we really have a crisis. There's no debate about that. When it comes to technology and poor waste management practices, we have to think about the circular economy. That's the key for me in terms of technology, whatever it happens to be. For me and my company, we've been designing software for the waste and recycling sector for some 20 years now. A key product, Waste and Recycling One, is really a material tracking solution. So what it's trying to do is it's trying to track from the collection of that waste, from your house, my house, from the commercial sector, what is that waste, what containers are in that waste, what the volumes of that waste are, getting the drivers and the trucks out on the road the most efficient way, getting into the sites across the weigh bridges, managing weighing that waste, segregating that waste, and hopefully that waste is going off to a good a recycling facility, not to landfill, right, as we've been talked about. So what we're doing as technology is really monitoring and trying to measure the waste collected. Ideally, we need to keep it out of landfill. That's the objective. But think about all the great technology. There's a lot of IoT. So believe it or not, you put a volumetric sensor in a rubbish bin. So let the bin tell you when it's full. Which is great, so that's really, and that optimizes waste collections, so we're not having trucks running around emptying a lot of empty bins. It helps manage the volumes. We've got great, for instance, there's a great point of sale that goes into restaurants where restaurants weigh their offcuts, their waste of their food waste. They weigh it, they put in what type of waste is, and before they put it in their food bins. And what that enables a restaurant to do is work out what's getting wasted. And help get their menu a little bit more in tune with less waste and less consumption. But look, I saw something recently in South America where they're equipping vultures with GoPros to identify fly tipping. So is that a technical improvement? Maybe it is, right? But there is some great things happening in terms of technology for what we're doing in waste management and really helping to keep stuff out of landfill ultimately.
Talk about nature-based solutions, eh?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I'm not sure everyone would appreciate that one, but it is a good one.
And encouraging individuals and businesses to adopt responsible waste disposal behaviours can be challenging. What strategies, initiatives and tactics are needed to promote behaviour change, raise awareness and realise actual change for the betterment of the planet?
Yes, change, cultural change. The simple answer is we need to waste less, And I think I'd like to take this chance to lay down a couple of big challenges. I think the first thing is convenience is killing the planet. And we need to be more, I would say, inconvenient or do things that are more inconvenient. Now, take a couple of simple examples. Single-use plastics, coffee cups. We all know we could take a coffee cup, we could wash it, put it in our bag, hand it over and get that coffee cup filled again, right? We all know that when we buy a pack of sandwiches, we probably in the morning could have spent another couple of minutes making a sandwich, sticking it in a reusable plastic, And so those sort of things are more inconvenient. But you imagine if we could all save on our sandwich wrappers, just simple things can make a big difference. I think the other thing that probably annoys me a little bit as a New Zealander and a bit of a DIY guy is that, and we've all done it, the washing machine breaks down. And you think, right, first place you go is the internet. Next day, brand new washing machine arrives. Old one out the door. And you hope the old one is going to be, recycled or reprocessed in the right way. Most likely not. So again, let's be more inconvenient. instead of going to buy a new one, let's find someone who can fix it, you know, and it might be inconvenient because we've got to wait. It might take us a couple of days. You know, we might not be able to do our washing tomorrow, and we might have to wait around for the guy to turn up to fix the thing, right? So the list goes on. So, you know, the first challenge is, you know, let's think about that the convenience or being more inconvenient, I think. The second challenge, and we all know it, is we've really got a culture of consumerism. You know, we have to buy it. We have to buy less. We're all guilty of it. We need to reuse what we have, make that pair of shoes last another season. You know, we need to use things for longer. You know, we could borrow or rent instead of buying. You know, is another topic, and that takes us into another concept around producer responsibility, which is also in the Environmental Act, to say once you buy that washing machine, whoever sells you that washing machine is responsible when you're finished with it to take it back. Producer responsibility or extended producer responsibility. So when that company sell you that washing machine, they might think, hang on, well, I might use some recycled materials in that. I might make sure everything in that machine is recyclable. I might make it last a bit longer because I don't want to be coming back fixing it all the time. And then it's their responsibility to take it away. So there's, again, you know, that consumerism is we're consuming, we're creating vast amounts of stuff, you know, which unfortunately majority of which is going to landfill. But the last thing I'd like to say on this point is that, and I've got a bit of a strong view around this, and I think back to the original story, that we've been living very much a false economy when it comes to waste management, right? We know it. You put it in the black bag, goes at the gate, and then in our minds it's someone else's problem, you know. And, you know, I think about Dad and my trips to the dump. You know, this stuff we didn't pay to go into the dump. There was no cost of it. The suppliers of the stuff we're throwing away had no cost associated with that. And, you know, there was a false economy. So there is a bit of legislation it might sound a bit unusual, but in some parts of the world there's a pay as you throw. So take our example, right? We've got some bins at the gate. So those bins, I've got my recycling bin, my general waste bin, my food waste bin, let's say. Each of those bins will have an RFID chip in it. So that chip will say that's my bin with that waste type in it. Truck comes down the road. In the truck is a weighing equipment, and there's a wee reader that when he picks the bin up, he says, well, that's Chris's bin, and it's got general waste in it, you know, heaven forbid. Puts it down, gets the net weight, and as soon as that bin goes down and the bin's weight, I get an invoice, real time. And if I haven't been bothered to sort my waste and I put everything in my, let's say, my black bin, my general waste bin, I should get a big invoice for that. If I've taken some time and I've recycled my waste, I've got my food waste out, the main bit of food waste I get a wee rebate for, because food waste has a great value in terms of an anaerobic digestion part. So the whole idea is that I think until we as individuals start to get hit in the pocket, we aren't ever really going to truly change our behaviour. So interesting thoughts.
Wow, that certainly is quite innovative, if you will, and I guess in some parts controversial.
It is, yeah, it's right. Yeah, not because you probably put your waste in someone else's bin, you know, the neighbour's bin, right? Yeah. You know, so it's not without challenges, of course, but it's a good, you know, it's been proven and is working in a lot of places.
Well, it's certainly food for thought. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Chris.
Pleasure.
And where can people find you?
Yes, LinkedIn, Chris Williams, ISB Global is our company name, and we're there. You know, we're out there. We're getting the message out there as much as we can. Look me up, spread the good word.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Very good. Thanks, Sharon.